Hello, welcome to IDDTalks here at AD University. My name is Anastasia Lavrina, and now I'm joined by a very distinguished guest from the United States of America, Eugene Chausovsky, who is a Senior Director, Analytical Development and Training, New Lines Institute. Warm welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. So in this particular episode, I'm planning to discuss the event which happened just recently on January 13. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Foreign Minister of Armenia, Arat Mirzoyan, met in Washington to announce the release of the Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity Implementation Framework. I would say that was quite significant event, and we are waiting the process itself on how it will be implemented, how and when, and whether there are some elements which still requires additional discussions. So let me start with this question. What's your overall assessment of this document, which does not impose, nor does it intend to impose, any legal commitments or obligations on the United States of America or Armenia?
Right. So I think, as you just mentioned, I think it's worth starting off that this is a framework agreement, so there's no legal, obligations here. But I do think it's very significant in that it shows a continued attention from the U.S. on the Caucasus region. It shows follow through from, of course, the landmark peace treaty initialing, at least the initialing of intentions to have peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which was, of course, overseen by President Trump last August. And we've seen now a continuation of that. Obviously the diplomatic and security component is a very important part, but just as important, I think, are the economic implications and the connectivity efforts. So the fact that we're seeing continued engagement out of the US and we're seeing some, I think, advancement on a pretty technical level, I think is the most notable element of this.
Well, but is this framework primarily a connectivity and transit document, or does it carry deeper political and security objectives behind the technical language?
So I think you can't completely remove the political and security dimensions from this. I know that there's even some mention of, ensuring the security of these routes, of these infrastructure projects, if and when they come into play. But I do think it is primarily from the U.S. standpoint driven by a desire to not only engage diplomatically with the region, but also to have some economic benefits, of course, for Armenia, for Azerbaijan, but for the U.S. itself. And I think this is a big part of the ownership, structure that's kind of outlined in this framework deal with, I believe, the U.S. having something around 70%, 70 to 74% of it. So I think the primary motivation is economic, but you can't divorce the security and political components.
Well, how does this framework align with a broader U.S. strategy in the South Caucasus?
Well, I think it aligns in terms of, maintaining and advancing peace processes, not only in the Caucasus, but also in other parts of the world. But this has been, I think, one of the more successful examples of that. Of course, we can't remove the geopolitical realities, the location of the Caucasus, with everything going on right now in Iran, the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. This does give the U.S. some leverage and some positioning in an area where, some of its competitors are quite active or at least have interests there. So I think it's a number of different things. There's no one motivation, but certainly I think it advances a number of these different interests simultaneously.
But Mr. Chausovsky, looking at the text closely, are there components that could become contentious due to regional politics or competing external interests?
I think that's always going to be a factor. I mean, I think Russia and Iran have made no secret that they're not exactly the biggest supporters of East-West connectivity, especially linking this region to Europe, and even beyond potentially. They, of course, would like to see more connections, north-south with their countries, and are in general, very skeptical of any kind of U.S. or generally Western, but especially US involvement in this region. So that will always be a factor, but I do think that, given how things have played out, given that their attention is right now currently elsewhere, in Iran, obviously domestically, in Russia, it's on the Ukraine conflict. There is a window of opportunity here, and it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, right? These are not inherently against these countries, this East-West connectivity. But I think there will be certainly some, suspicion at the very least from these countries.
But the framework doesn't say anything about when the construction will begin. How significant is that omission?
Well, I think that these we're still in the kind of early stages, right? We had the initialing of this, at least the intentions to form a peace agreement. This in turn will hopefully unlock some of these connectivity plans, but I think it just reflects that it is still early on, and there are still things that could, shape. There are technical things that have to be worked out, investment arrangements. Who is actually going to be providing the funding for these types of things. So I think it's just a reflection of the reality. This is kind of how these types of large-scale connectivity projects operate. But hopefully, as these talks continue and get from the political dimension into more of the technical dimension, then that timeline will hopefully reveal itself and hopefully sooner rather than later.
Another important element, it's about the company which is going to be established to monitor the work itself, the implementation of what was written. And if I'm not mistaken, the ownership is divided in a frame of 74% belongs to the United States and 26% belongs to Armenia. What does this 74/26 ownership structure tell us about who will actually control the corridor during the crucial early decades of implementation?
So this is, I think, the element that's still being worked out, and there's been timelines even kind of changing that ownership structure over time if that gets extended into 10, even 50 years. I think that was thrown around. So I think that will matter more once we actually see the rubber hit the road, so to speak. But I think the main element here is to show that the U.S. is committed to this region, wants to increase its engagement, again, not only diplomatically, but also in a very tangible way. Of course, we have to, raise the China factor here as well, with China being quite involved in this region and obviously with its Belt and Road Initiative. So that will also, I think, shape the extent and the nature in which the U.S. gets involved. But I think certainly we'll start to see if we see the continuation of the trend lines, then I think we will start to see, real tangible progress in the coming months.
I would say another very important element, the document repeatedly emphasizes Armenian sovereignty and jurisdiction. Is that just clarifying language, or does it reflect deeper political sensitiveness?
I think absolutely that's a nod to some political sensitivities. Obviously, this is a contentious issue within Armenia when we're talking about any type of corridor or any type of international transit project. This is something that has been raised, and has been, a challenge, let's say, politically within Armenia for Prime Minister Pashinyan. So I think, as part of this framework agreement, and again, there's nothing binding here at the moment. I think this reflects those concerns. Without that level of buy-in from the Armenian government, these projects are not going to be able to move forward. So I think this is a way to address those concerns without, having it prohibit any further advancements.
Well, how could the Trump route, or as it's mostly known, Zengizur corridor, reshape Armenia's dependency on Russian transport, customs, and logistics infrastructure over time?
Well, that obviously depends on to what extent this will actually get implemented, but I think that is one of the main motivations. And I think one of the reasons I should say that we've seen a lot of progress both diplomatically and on at least outlining the framework of such agreements is Armenia's recognition that it does need to diversify, that its reliance, overwhelmingly on Russia, not only security, but also economically has not fared very well for Yerevan. So it's not to say that it's a complete replacement of that vector. I think Russia will continue to be an important player within Armenia in several ways. But Armenia has acknowledged the need in order to diversify, whether that's opening the vector, obviously with Azerbaijan, opening the vector with Turkey, getting U.S. involvement in all of that, bridging those gaps with the European side as well. So I think this is a very critical part of the reality that Armenia is facing and planning its strategy accordingly.
Well, and one more question I have. From a security perspective, how important is the Trump route for the region? Could it realistically contribute to a more stable security environment in the South Caucasus?
That's certainly the intended goal. With that level of increased engagement, diplomatically needs to come some level of understanding and some level of, comfort, primarily from Armenia that, as they're kind of shifting their foreign policy in many ways and trying to diversify their economic relationships, they need the level of both political stability at home and security stability within the region. And I think this is part of a very important part where U.S. engagement will continue to be a factor. Obviously, as I mentioned, there are countries and parties that will serve as challenges, but I think that it can still be very effective as long as that commitment and that engagement continues and hopefully grows over time.
Mr. Chausovsky, thank you. Thank you so much for joining IDDTalks today.
Great. Thank you so much.